I am Olivia, 33 years old, and in my family the son gets everything. My parents paid my brother's rent, bought him a house, and cleared his massive debts without blinking. But at our annual Christmas dinner, he discovered I had quietly built a $36 million company completely on my own. He literally fell to the floor crying, demanding I hand over at least $17 million to make things fair. My mother screamed that I had stolen his future while my father slid a pen across the table. I just smiled, knowing I had already orchestrated their financial ruin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to profit off your hard work. The shatter of crystal echoed through the formal dining room of my parents' sprawling suburban estate in Chicago. Red wine dripped down the imported floral wallpaper like blood. My mother Patricia stood at the head of the table, her chest heaving, the stem of her broken wineglass still clutched in her shaking hand. On the Persian rug at her feet, my 35-year-old brother Brandon was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He was hyperventilating, clutching his chest, rolling on the floor in a theatrical panic attack that a soap opera actor would envy. Between his exaggerated gasps, he pointed a trembling finger at the object that had triggered this utter meltdown. It was a crumpled copy of Forbes magazine lying face up near the fireplace. My face was on the cover. The headline, printed in bold black letters, announced my software company had just reached a $36 million valuation. "You stole his future!" my mother shrieked, her voice cracking with a hysterical edge that made the silver cutlery vibrate against the fine china. "You hid this wealth from us while your brother has been suffering. You selfish, greedy girl!" I sat perfectly still in my chair, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not flinch. I did not apologize. I just looked at the three of them, letting the sheer absurdity of the moment wash over me. Across the table, Brandon's wife Jasmine, a sharp and successful African-American real estate broker, sat completely frozen. Her eyes darted between her sobbing husband and me. She remained silent, but the tight set of her jaw told me she was processing this chaotic scene just as analytically as I was. My father, Richard, slammed his heavy fist on the solid oak table. "Stop looking so smug, Olivia," he growled, his face flushed a deep purple. "Your brother is drowning in debt. His crypto investments failed. His business went under. And you sit there with $36 million. You are going to fix this tonight." He reached into his tailored suit jacket pocket, pulled out a silver fountain pen, and practically threw it across the polished wood. It clattered aggressively against my dinner plate. "You are going to write a check right now," my father demanded, leaning over the table until he was inches from my face. $17 million. That makes things equal. It splits the family assets fairly. It is the only right thing to do after you deceitfully hoarded this money while we struggled to keep Brandon afloat. $17 million. He demanded it with the casual authority of a man asking someone to pass the salt. I looked down at the pen, then down at my brother, who was peeking through his fingers to see if his crying was having the desired effect. For my entire life, this was exactly how our household operated. The world always revolved around Brandon. When we were younger, my parents literally emptied my college savings account to buy him a luxury sports car because he felt insecure next to his wealthy fraternity brothers. Years later, when I desperately needed $5,000 to buy the initial server racks to launch my software platform, my father laughed in my face and told me not to waste his time with silly little hobbies. They had bought Brandon a $1.2 million house. They had quietly paid off his $400,000 credit card debt when his digital currency business went bankrupt. They had bled their own distribution company dry to fund his endless string of failures. And now, because I had spent the last 5 years working 80-hour weeks, skipping vacations, and building a massive enterprise in total secrecy, they felt entitled to half of my life's work. "You owe him," my mother sobbed, dropping to her knees to cradle Brandon's head against her chest. "He is your brother. He is the heir to this family. You have taken the spotlight and the resources that should have been his. You stole his destiny, Olivia. The financial abuse was so deeply ingrained in their psychology that they truly believed my success was a theft against Brandon. In their twisted reality, any money that belonged to me was simply money I was keeping away from him. You are not leaving this house until you make this right, my father added, moving to stand directly between me and the dining room archway. We are a family. We share our wealth. You are not going to be a billionaire while your brother loses everything. I took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the scent of roasted turkey and suffocating tension. I felt no fear, only a cold, clinical detachment. I had spent years preparing for the day they would inevitably find out about my company. I knew the guilt trips, the screaming, and the demands would come. What they did not realize was that I had not just built a tech empire. I had built an impenetrable fortress, and their attacks were completely useless. I smiled, letting them think they still had control. I picked up the silver fountain pen my father had thrown at me. It felt heavy, cold, and expensive. I turned it slowly in my hands, letting the silence stretch until my mother stopped her performative sobbing and Brandon peeked through his fingers again. I did not write a check. Instead, I placed the pen gently next to my untouched wine glass. $17 million, I said, my voice barely above a whisper yet loud enough to command the entire room. You want me to write a check for $17 million to equalize the family assets? It is only fair, my father said, crossing his arms and blocking the doorway like a bouncer. You have more than enough. Your brother needs capital to get back on his feet. I looked directly at Brandon, who was now sitting up on the rug, sniffling loudly while leaning against our mother's knees. Let us talk about fairness, Dad. Let us talk about family assets. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. 2 years ago, when Brandon decided he was too good to rent an apartment like a normal person, you and Mom bought him the 5-bedroom property in Oak Brook. The exact purchase price was $1,200,000, paid in cash. That was an investment in his future, my mother snapped, her face turning red. A man needs a proper home to build a family. An investment? I repeated smoothly. Interesting. How about last year Brandon launched that ridiculous crypto exchange that went bankrupt in 3 months? He racked up $400,000 in credit card debt funding, lavish trips to Dubai and Miami to court fake investors. You liquidated a massive portion of your own company's operating capital to clear that debt. $400,000 wiped clean, just so he would not have to declare bankruptcy. He was a victim of market volatility, my father yelled, stepping closer to the table. You do not understand the pressure he is under. He is an entrepreneur. I understand business perfectly well, Dad, I replied, keeping my voice dangerously calm. Which brings me to my next point. 6 years ago, I came to you with a business plan, a meticulously researched, fully developed proposal for my software platform. I needed exactly $5,000 to lease my first server racks. I did not even ask for a gift. I asked you to co-sign a loan because I was working 2 minimum wage jobs and my credit was thin. Brandon scoffed from the floor, suddenly finding his voice. Your little computer project was a joke, Olivia. Nobody thought you would actually make money from it. I ignored him, keeping my eyes locked on my father. You told me $5,000 was a waste of money. You told me to get a real job as a receptionist. You said supporting my delusions would be bad parenting. I paused, letting the words hang in the heavy air. You refused to guarantee a $5,000 loan for your daughter, but you burned $1.6 million bailing out your son. And now you demand $17 million from the very project you called a joke. That is different, my mother shrieked, slamming her hand against the floor. He is your brother. We have to protect him. You are a woman, Olivia. You do not have the same responsibilities. You were supposed to find a husband to provide for you, not sneak around hoarding millions of dollars while your own flesh and blood starves. Jasmine shifted uncomfortably in her chair across from me. Her eyes widened at my mother's blatant misogyny. She looked at Brandon, who was nodding vigorously in agreement with our mother. I could see the disgust brewing behind Jasmine's calm exterior. Starves! I laughed, a sharp, cold sound that echoed off the high ceiling. Brandon is wearing a $3,000 suit right now. He drove here in a luxury SUV that you are paying the lease on. Nobody in this room is starving. You are just terrified that the world finally sees Brandon for exactly what he is. Do not speak about your brother that way, my father bellowed, pointing a thick finger at my face. He has potential. He just needs a proper runway. Your 17 million will give him the foundation he needs to launch his next venture. We are family, Olivia. We do not keep score. You have kept score my entire life. I shot back, my voice finally rising to match his volume. Every holiday, every graduation, every milestone. Brandon got the praise, the funding, the grace, and the second chances. I got the leftovers and the lectures. You never saw me as an equal. You only see me now because I have something you want. You owe us, Brandon yelled, scrambling to his feet. He pointed furiously at the Forbes magazine on the rug. I shared my connections with you. I introduced you to people. I practically gave you the confidence to start that company. I stared at him in pure disbelief. The delusion was so deep it was almost fascinating. You introduced me to exactly no one, Brandon. You mocked me every time I opened my laptop. You told your friends I was a loser. I gave you the drive, he insisted, his face twisted in desperate rage. If I had not been tough on you, you never would have worked so hard. I was the catalyst. That makes me part of your success. My mother stood up, smoothing her dress, her eyes flashing with a predatory gleam. He is right. We pushed you. We made you independent. You built this company on the foundation of the work ethic we instilled. Therefore, a portion of that company rightfully belongs to this family. You will write that $17 million check for your brother right now, or we will simply take you to court and take every single cent ourselves. I stared at my mother, absorbing the sheer audacity of her threat. But before I could respond, the most remarkable transformation occurred. Brandon's pathetic weeping stopped instantly. The supposed panic attack that had him writhing on the Persian rug vanished like smoke. He stood up, dusted off the knees of his expensive tailored trousers, and adjusted his cuffs. His face morphed from a mask of victimhood into a chillingly smug grin. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick, stapled stack of legal paper. He walked over to my side of the table and slapped the document down right on top of my plate. The thud rattled the fine silverware. We do not need to go to court if you just sign this, Brandon said, his voice completely steady now, devoid of any tears. My lawyer drafted it yesterday as soon as the Forbes article dropped. It is an equity transfer agreement. I glanced down at the bold heading on the first page. It was a formal, legally binding demand for exactly 40% ownership of my proprietary software platform. 40%. I read aloud, my tone flat. You want 40% of a company you did not even know existed until 24 hours ago. I am a co-founder, Brandon stated proudly, puffing out his chest. I provided the initial seed capital that made your entire operation possible. I looked at him, genuinely baffled for a fraction of a second. Seed capital? You have never given me a dime in your life. 10 years ago, Brandon said, leaning over the table. When your cheap little computer crashed during your finals, I let you borrow my old Dell laptop for 6 months. You used that machine to write your first lines of code. You used my hardware to build the foundation of your platform. In the tech world, providing the initial hardware is an infrastructure investment. That makes me an early-stage investor and a co-founder. 40% is actually a discount considering the risk I took. I stared at him, letting the absolute lunacy of his argument sink in. A 10-year-old virus-ridden laptop that he had tossed in a closet because the screen was cracked. He was using a piece of electronic garbage as the legal basis for claiming $14 million worth of equity. My father nodded firmly, crossing his arms. It is a rock-solid legal argument, Olivia. He gave you the tools to succeed. You used family resources. The contract is binding once you sign it, and it saves us all the embarrassment of a public lawsuit. Just sign the paper, transfer the shares, and we can all go back to enjoying our Christmas dinner as a united family. I looked across the table at Jasmine. She was staring at the contract with her mouth slightly open, her dark eyes reflecting pure shock. As a real estate broker, she understood contracts, and she clearly recognized the sheer predatory insanity of her husband's demand. She looked away, staring down at her lap, her hands gripping her napkins so tightly her knuckles were turning white. I picked up the document. The paper was heavy stock. Brandon had actually paid a lawyer to draft this extortion attempt. I flipped through the pages pretending to read. "So let me get this straight," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on the paper. "You want me to dilute my venture capital partners, restructure my entire capitalization table, and hand over 40% voting rights to a man who just bankrupted a crypto exchange. You want to be on the board of directors of a supply chain logistics software company." "I have a great business mind," Brandon said defensively. "I just had bad luck with the market. With me on the board, we can scale this thing globally." "You could not scale a lemonade stand," I replied. I gripped the thick stack of paper with both hands. With one swift, forceful motion, I ripped the entire contract perfectly in half. "What are you doing?" my mother gasped, lunging forward. I put the halves together and tore them again, shredding the legal threat into quarters. I let the pieces flutter down onto my plate, burying the roasted turkey and cranberry sauce under a pile of useless confetti. "I am leaving," I said, pushing my chair back. It scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I stood up and grabbed my wool coat from the back of the chair. "You are not going anywhere," my father roared. He stepped directly into my path, his massive frame blocking the only exit from the dining room. "You are going to sit back down and we are going to finish this negotiation. You owe this family." I slipped my arms into my coat and looked him dead in the eye. "Move out of my way, Dad. If you block me for one more second, I will dial emergency services and report you for false imprisonment. Do you want police cruisers flashing their lights outside your house on Christmas Eve in front of all your wealthy neighbors? Because I will make that call right now." My father hesitated. The threat of public embarrassment was the only thing more powerful than his greed. His jaw clenched, but he slowly took a step to the side. I walked past him, my heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. I did not look back at my mother, who was shrieking my name, or at Brandon, who was furiously picking up the shredded pieces of his extortion attempt. I walked down the grand hallway, opened the heavy oak front door, and stepped out into the freezing Chicago night. The icy wind whipped across my face, a stark and refreshing contrast to the suffocating heat of that dining room. Snow was falling heavily, blanketing the upscale neighborhood. I marched down the driveway, my boots crunching in the fresh snow, and unlocked my car. I slid into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and let out a long, shaky breath. The silence of the car was absolute perfection. I reached forward to start the engine, eager to leave this toxic nightmare behind forever. Just as my finger pressed the ignition button, my phone lit up in the cup holder. It vibrated violently against the plastic. I picked it up, expecting a barrage of angry texts from my mother. Instead, it was a high-priority security alert from my private bank. The notification banner glowed bright red against my screen. "Urgent action required." I swiped open the message. Someone had just attempted to access my emergency trust account, the secure holding where I kept my liquid operational funds. They had failed the security questions 5 times in a row, triggering an automatic lockdown. I scrolled down to check the security log. The bank provided the IP address of the device attempting the hack. I recognized the network ping immediately. It was registered to the router inside my parents' house. While they were aggressively screaming at me down in the formal dining room, someone had been hiding upstairs, actively trying to drain my secure financial accounts. I stared at the glowing red security alert, illuminating the dark interior of my car. The absolute brazenness of it sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through my veins. While my father was physically blocking my exit and my mother was screaming about family loyalty, they had orchestrated a simultaneous digital heist. Brandon must have slipped away during the initial confrontation. Or perhaps they had hired a proxy to sit in one of the upstairs bedrooms, hammering away at my banking portal while I was distracted. I immediately tapped the emergency lockdown button on my banking app. Within seconds, my entire financial portfolio was frozen impenetrable to anyone, including myself, without a physical visit to my private wealth manager. I shifted my car into drive and pulled away from the sprawling estate, the tires crunching loudly over the fresh snow. I drove back to my downtown penthouse in total silence, calculating my next moves. the physical threat was over, but the psychological warfare was just beginning. I knew my mother better than anyone. Patricia never lost gracefully. If she could not extort me in private, she would try to execute me in public. I went to sleep that night with my phone on Do Not Disturb, fully prepared for the storm that would inevitably hit by morning. I woke up at 6 o'clock on Christmas morning to a phone that was practically vibrating off my nightstand. The screen displayed over 80 missed calls and hundreds of unread text messages. It was not a coordinated holiday greeting. It was a digital firing squad. I brewed a cup of black coffee, sat down at my kitchen island overlooking the Chicago skyline, and finally opened my social media applications. There it was, right at the top of my feed. My mother had published a 5-paragraph manifesto on Facebook tagging every single extended family member, family friend, and business associate she could find. She had even attached a heavily edited black and white photograph of Brandon looking agonizingly out of a window, appearing fragile and deeply sorrowful. The narrative she spun was a masterpiece of manipulative fiction. According to Patricia, I had transformed into a ruthless, greedy billionaire who had abandoned her own flesh and blood. She wrote that Brandon was suffering from severe clinical depression, a condition she claimed was entirely exacerbated by my cruel refusal to help him during his darkest hour. She painted him as a selfless, loving brother who had sacrificed his youth to support my dreams, only to be cast aside the moment I achieved success. The post continued with increasingly dramatic fabrications. She claimed I had shown up to their quiet Christmas Eve dinner just to flaunt my wealth, that I had laughed in their faces when they humbly asked for a small temporary loan to keep Brandon from losing his home, and that I had violently smashed dishes before storming out. She ended the public broadcast with a plea for prayers, stating that the family was completely heartbroken by the monster I had become. The response from the extended family was swift, brutal, and entirely predictable. My inbox was a toxic wasteland of guilt trips and outright insults. My Uncle David left a voicemail calling me a sociopath who had forgotten where she came from. My cousin Brenda, who had not spoken to me in 7 years, sent a massive block of text accusing me of driving my brother to the brink of suicide. Aunts who relied on my parents for social standing flooded my messages with Bible verses about greed and the sanctity of family, demanding I return to the house immediately to apologize and make things right. They were acting as perfect flying monkeys, carrying out my mother's bidding without ever questioning the validity of her claims. In the past, this coordinated emotional assault would have crushed me. When I was younger, the sheer terror of being ostracized by the entire family would have sent me running back to them begging for forgiveness, eager to pay whatever price they demanded just to restore the peace. But I was not that scared college dropout anymore. I was a 33-year-old executive who managed complex supply chain crises and negotiated with hostile corporate board members for a living. I recognized this tactic for exactly what it was: an extinction burst. They were losing control over their primary target, so they were escalating their behavior to extreme levels, desperately trying to force a reaction. So I gave them absolutely nothing. I did not type out a defensive reply. I did not post a counterstatement exposing Brandon's extortion attempt. I did not answer a single phone call to justify my actions or argue about the truth. I simply sat at my kitchen island sipping my coffee and watched the messages roll in. Total unbothered silence. My absolute refusal to engage was the one reaction Patricia had not prepared for. She thrived on conflict. She needed me to argue back so she could twist my words and continue playing the victim. By depriving her of that ammunition, I was suffocating her narrative. By noon, her frustration began bleeding through the digital void. The public Facebook updates grew increasingly unhinged, shifting from sorrowful prayers to aggressive, passive-aggressive quotes about toxic children. Then the direct messages from her started hitting my phone. First, they were angry demands that I answer my cousins. Then they devolved into erratic threats about exposing my personal life to the press. She sent texts calling me a coward for hiding behind my wealth. She demanded to know why I was ignoring the family I was supposed to love. Every unanswered message fueled her desperation. Her carefully crafted facade of the heartbroken mother was cracking under the weight of my indifference. She was spiraling into a frantic rage, completely unaware that her public meltdown was giving me all the time and space I needed to prepare a counterstrike that would permanently dismantle their entire empire. The morning after Christmas brought a deceptive stillness. I woke up early, completed my usual workout, and sat down at my home office desk to review the upcoming quarter projections. The digital silence from my extended family was a welcome relief. My mother had apparently realized that flooding my personal inbox was useless. But my sense of victory was incredibly short-lived. At exactly 8 in the morning, my phone illuminated with an urgent incoming call from Ryan, my chief operating officer. Ryan never called before 9, unless the servers were actively crashing or a major enterprise client was threatening to pull their contract. I answered the call, my mind instantly shifting from family drama to executive crisis management. Ryan sounded unusually panicked, his breathing fast and shallow. He told me to immediately open my laptop and check our primary corporate social media channels. I pulled up LinkedIn and our official company page. A cold wave of disbelief washed over me. Over the course of the night, our impeccably maintained digital footprint had been utterly decimated. Hundreds of new reviews had flooded our profiles, all rating our software platform with a single star. The comments attached to these reviews were vicious, fabricated, and highly coordinated. They accused my company of stealing data, mistreating employees, and engaging in fraudulent billing practices. Dozens of fresh posts on LinkedIn tagged my personal profile, describing me as a sociopathic CEO who routinely violated labor laws and operated a toxic workplace. The accounts posting these defamatory claims had zero connections, stock profile pictures, and generic names. It was a classic heavy-handed bot farm attack. Brandon had clearly escalated his extortion campaign from emotional manipulation to active corporate sabotage. He was spending the very money my parents had likely handed him to hire cheap digital mercenaries to tank my brand reputation. "It gets worse," Ryan said through the speaker, his voice tight with anxiety. "Check your primary investor relations inbox. I just got forwarded an email from the managing partner at Vanguard Capital. They are demanding an emergency meeting at noon." Vanguard Capital was our lead investor. They were the key players holding the term sheet for our upcoming Series B funding round, a financial injection that would propel my software platform to global scaling. If Vanguard pulled out, the entire round would collapse, taking our market momentum with it. I opened my inbox and found the forwarded message. My hands clenched into tight fists as I read the subject line: Notice of pending litigation and intellectual property dispute. Brandon had not just sent an email. He had paid a desperate low-tier attorney to draft a highly inflammatory legal notice, claiming that my entire software architecture was built on stolen hardware and proprietary concepts that belonged to him. The document demanded an immediate freeze on all corporate transactions until his 40% equity claim could be validated in court. The legal basis was entirely non-existent, relying on the same ridiculous delusion about the old laptop he had screamed about at Christmas dinner. But the actual merit of the claim did not matter. What mattered was the delivery method. Brandon had deliberately copied the entire executive board of Vanguard Capital alongside 3 other major venture capital firms involved in our Series B negotiations. He had dropped a massive radioactive bomb directly onto the negotiating table. Venture capitalists hate uncertainty. They despise family drama, and they run away from intellectual property disputes faster than anything else in the financial sector. Brandon knew exactly what he was doing. He was not trying to win a lawsuit. He was executing a calculated threat. He was showing me that if I did not pay his $17 million ransom, he would gladly burn my entire $36 million empire to the ground. He was holding my funding round hostage, betting that I would quietly pay him off just to make the legal headache disappear before the investors got spooked and withdrew their capital. It was a classic blackmail maneuver, dressed up in cheap legal jargon and delivered with maximum collateral damage. I could feel the anger burning in my chest, a hot and dangerous contrast to the cold calculation I usually maintained. My brother, a man who had never worked an honest day in his life, was actively trying to destroy the livelihoods of the 80 employees who depended on my company. He was jeopardizing years of my grueling labor because he felt entitled to the fruits of my suffering. "Tell Vanguard we will take the meeting at noon," I instructed Ryan, forcing my voice to remain completely level. "Tell our legal team to draft a holding statement regarding a frivolous extortion attempt by an estranged family member. Have our IT department trace the origin of the Biot farm and flag every single fake review for immediate removal by the platform administrators. Do not show any panic. We handle this clinically." Ryan agreed and disconnected to execute my orders. I sat back in my chair, staring at the fraudulent legal notice glowing on my monitor. Brandon and my parents thought they had backed me into a corner. They believed that by threatening my professional reputation and my investor relations, they could force me into submission. They assumed I would act like the scared girl they used to bully, desperate to throw money at a problem just to avoid public embarrassment. They severely underestimated my tolerance for warfare. They had brought their petty, toxic extortion tactics into my professional arena. They had crossed the one boundary I fiercely protected. I reached for my phone, scrolling past the missed calls from my family, and found the private contact number for Harrison. He was the most ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney in Chicago, a man who specialized in crushing frivolous litigation and destroying corporate saboteurs. It was time to stop playing defense. I was going to obliterate them. I dialed Harrison immediately. He answered on the second ring, his tone as crisp and unforgiving as a freshly minted $100 bill. I explained the situation, detailing Brandon's fraudulent legal notice and the coordinated bot attack on my company's social platforms. I expected Harrison to recommend a massive public relations counteroffensive to protect the upcoming funding round. Instead, he chuckled a low and menacing sound that sent a shiver of anticipation down my spine. He told me to come to his downtown office within the hour. When I arrived, Harrison was already standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner suite, looking down at the frozen streets of Chicago. He was 45, impeccably dressed in a charcoal bespoke suit, possessing the lethal calmness of a predator studying its prey. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He turned around, gestured for me to sit at his massive mahogany conference table, and pushed a sleek tablet in my direction. "We are not fighting this in the court of public opinion," Harrison stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Public relations battles validate the attacker. If we issue press releases denying Brandon's claims, we give his extortion attempt legitimacy in the eyes of your venture capital investors. We will not legitimize a desperate shakedown." He tapped the tablet screen, bringing up a drafted legal document. "Instead, we strike directly at the source of his funding and his perceived safety net. We hit your parents. We are bypassing your brother entirely because he is merely the attack dog. Patricia and Richard hold the leash. This is a cease and desist order, but it is not addressed to Brandon. I have addressed it directly to your father's distribution company, naming their corporate entity as a partner in a coordinated campaign of tortious interference and corporate sabotage." I leaned forward, reading the aggressive legal jargon. Harrison had brilliantly linked the IP addresses from the bank hack attempt to the corporate network of my parents' distribution business. By demonstrating that family resources and company infrastructure were being used to actively damage my enterprise, Harrison was effectively threatening to sue their entire livelihood into oblivion. "If they do not retract the false claims and withdraw that ridiculous intellectual property notice by close of business today," Harrison explained smoothly, "I will file a lawsuit that will immediately freeze their corporate operational accounts. They want to play corporate warfare. We will show them what a real corporate execution looks like." I authorized the strike without a single moment of hesitation. Harrison hit send, dispatching the legal threat via email and certified courier directly to my father's executive office. While we waited for the inevitable fallout, Harrison instructed his paralegals to run a comprehensive forensic financial background check on my parents' distribution company. We needed to understand the exact structure of the entity we were threatening to dismantle. I sat in the leather chair, sipping a glass of sparkling water expecting to see a healthy, thriving business profile. My parents had always projected an image of untouchable upper-middle-class wealth, flaunting country club memberships and luxury vehicles. 10 minutes later, Harrison's lead investigator walked into the room holding a printed dossier. He looked grim. He handed the file to Harrison, who scanned the first page. Harrison's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise, a rare occurrence for a man who made a living destroying corporate criminals. He slid the open folder across the polished wood table toward me. "Your parents are not just wealthy bullies trying to spoil their favorite son," Harrison said, his tone shifting from predatory to analytical. "They are completely and utterly broke." I stared at the financial disclosures in absolute shock. The distribution company was drowning under a mountain of toxic hidden debt. They had leveraged every single asset they owned. The commercial warehouse they operated out of had 3 separate mortgages piled onto it. Their inventory suppliers had placed liens against their future revenues due to months of unpaid invoices. The company was hemorrhaging cash at an alarming rate, barely surviving on high-interest short-term corporate loans that were rapidly approaching maturity. The luxurious lifestyle my parents paraded around Chicago was nothing but a fragile house of cards built on predatory lending and sheer denial. The horrific truth clicked into place, hitting me with the force of a freight train. The Christmas dinner ambush had never been about simply funding Brandon's next ridiculous business venture. It was an act of absolute desperation. They did not just want my $17 million to coddle their golden child. They actively needed my money to avoid imminent catastrophic bankruptcy. If they did not secure a massive influx of cash within the next few weeks, the commercial lenders would foreclose on their distribution company. They would lose their business, their sprawling estate, their luxury cars, and the elite social standing my mother valued above her own life. I was not just a piggy bank for Brandon. I was their only remaining lifeline to avoid complete financial annihilation. I drove my luxury car back to my corporate headquarters, completely ignoring the frantic calls from investors. My brilliant legal team was already handling the widespread public panic flawlessly. I walked directly into my private corner office and sat down at my heavy mahogany desk. I was no longer playing a weak game of defense against them. Just as I unlocked my computer monitor, a very sharp, loud knock echoed from my office door. "Come right in," I commanded loudly. The heavy door clicked open. I fully expected to see my loyal assistant. Instead, a very familiar figure stepped inside, quickly closing the solid oak door behind her. It was actually Jasmine. Brandon's 31-year-old African-American wife stood there looking totally out of her element. The normally sharp, highly successful real estate agent looked absolutely terrified. Clutched tightly against her chest, as if her entire life depended on it, was a very thick manila envelope. I stood up slowly, my eyes locked on the thick manila envelope pressed against her chest. Jasmine was always the picture of perfection. In her world of high-end real estate, appearance was everything. I was used to seeing her in tailored designer suits, her hair flawlessly styled, projecting an aura of absolute control and confidence. But the woman standing in my office right now looked like she was about to collapse. Her hands were shaking visibly. Her eyes were red and swollen, stripped of their usual sharp calculation. "Jasmine," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Come in, sit down." She moved stiffly across the room, her designer heels sinking into the plush carpet, and collapsed into one of the leather guest chairs opposite my desk. She did not say a word at first. She just sat there staring blankly at the polished mahogany surface, taking ragged, uneven breaths. I walked over to the heavy oak door and locked it, ensuring we would not be interrupted. I pulled the blinds closed on the glass walls that overlooked the main operational floor of my company. Whatever she was about to show me, it was clearly explosive. I walked back to my desk, poured a glass of water from the carafe, and slid it toward her. "Drink this," I instructed, "then tell me exactly what is in that envelope." Jasmine reached out with trembling fingers. She took a small sip of water, swallowed hard, and then finally looked up at me. The sheer terror in her dark eyes was jarring. This was not the same woman who had sat quietly across from me at the Christmas dinner table 24 hours ago. This was a mother pushed to the absolute edge of survival. "He is going to destroy us, Olivia," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Brandon is going to destroy my entire life." She placed the thick manila envelope on the desk and pushed it toward me. I opened the metal clasp and pulled out a stack of dense legal and financial documents. The very first page was a formal notice of default and intent to foreclose. It was addressed to Brandon and Jasmine, referencing the $1.2 million property in Oakbrook that my parents had supposedly bought for them in cash. "Foreclosure?" I asked, my brow furrowing in confusion. "Mom and Dad bought that house outright. There is no primary mortgage." "Look at the second document," Jasmine replied, her voice turning bitter and hollow. "There is no primary mortgage. But there is a massive second mortgage, a home equity line of credit that was taken out 18 months ago for $800,000. I sifted through the papers and found the loan agreement. It was a predatory, high-interest commercial loan, the kind desperate people take when traditional banks slam the door in their faces. I flipped to the signature page. There, plain as day, were two signatures. Brandon's sloppy scrawl, and right beneath it, a smooth cursive signature spelling out Jasmine's full legal name. "I never signed that document," Jasmine stated, her tone shifting from despair to rising fury. "I am a licensed real estate broker, Olivia. I handle property contracts for a living. I would never under any circumstances leverage my primary residence with a shadow lender at a 14% interest rate. He forged my signature. He forged my signature in front of a corrupt notary that he probably paid off. He stole $800,000 of equity right out from under me and my children." I stared at the forged signature. It was a felony. Brandon had committed blatant wire fraud and forgery to secure a massive loan against a house he did not even buy. My mind raced, calculating the sheer scale of his deception. "Where did the money go?" I asked, looking up from the documents. "Mom and Dad cleared his $400,000 credit card debt last year. If he pulled another $800,000 out of your house, where is the cash? That is over $1 million vanished into thin air." Jasmine let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "He burned it, every single cent of it. Brandon did not just have a bad run with his crypto exchange. He is a degenerate gambling addict. When the crypto market crashed, he started chasing his losses through illegal offshore betting syndicates. He was desperately buying into worthless digital assets, dropping hundreds of thousands of dollars on non-existent digital real estate and useless artwork, hoping for a miracle flip to cover his tracks." She pulled a smaller stack of papers from her designer handbag and tossed them onto the desk. They were printed screenshots of digital wallets and transaction ledgers. "He leveraged our family home to gamble on the internet," Jasmine continued, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and cutting tracks through her makeup. "And he lost everything. The offshore syndicates started demanding payment. The lenders started sending collection notices to a post office box he rented secretly, so I would never see the mail. The only reason I found out is because a process server showed up at my real estate brokerage yesterday morning, right before Christmas Eve dinner, to hand me the final foreclosure warning." I looked at the dates on the foreclosure notice. The timeline was brutally tight. "How long do you have?" I asked softly. 2 weeks, Jasmine sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "The lender is executing the default clause on the 10th of January. If that loan is not brought current, they are seizing the house. My children and I will be thrown out onto the street in the middle of a Chicago winter. Everything I have worked for, my career, my license, my professional reputation, it will all be destroyed because my husband committed a massive financial felony." I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch. "We will stop him," I promised, staring into her terrified, desperate eyes. Jasmine let out a ragged breath, the tension in her shoulders breaking slightly at my words. She reached across the polished mahogany of my desk and gripped my hands. Her skin was ice cold. I expected her to express relief, to sink into the chair and let the tears flow freely. Instead, her dark eyes hardened, the desperation morphing into a sharp, crystalline fury. She pulled her hands back and sat up perfectly straight, channeling the formidable real estate broker I knew she was. "There is more, Olivia," Jasmine said, her voice dropping to a low, steady cadence. The forged signature and the impending foreclosure are not the worst parts of this nightmare. The worst part is that your parents knew. Richard and Patricia have known about the forgery for an entire month. I froze my hands resting flat on the desk. The air in my office suddenly felt thin. They knew Brandon committed a felony against his own wife and they did nothing. They did not just do nothing, Jasmine corrected, her tone laced with absolute venom. They actively conspired to cover it up. They orchestrated that entire chaotic scene at Christmas dinner, specifically to save him from federal prison. Your brother is not just a failed businessman facing bankruptcy. He is facing up to 30 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, identity theft, and bank fraud. If I go to the police and report the forged signature on that second mortgage, the shadow lenders will immediately turn the documents over to the authorities. Brandon will be arrested. I leaned back in my chair, piecing the horrifying puzzle together. The hysterical screaming, the shattered wine glass, the demand for exactly $17 million. It all made perfect, sickening sense now. They needed my money to pay off the illegal loan before the default date. I said the words tasting like ash in my mouth. They needed the cash to quietly wipe out the offshore gambling debts and satisfy the shadow lenders so you would never find out about the second mortgage. They were trying to extort me to fund a criminal cover-up. Exactly, Jasmine confirmed, pulling another folded document from her manila envelope. I found this in Brandon's home office safe last night while he was out drinking. It is a draft of a non-disclosure agreement. Your parents had their corporate lawyers prep it. If you had written that check or signed over the equity in your software company, they were going to use the funds to quietly extinguish the loan. Then they were going to force me to sign this non-disclosure agreement, keeping me completely blind to the fact that my husband had leveraged my home and forged my signature. They were willing to sacrifice your entire livelihood and my financial security just to keep their golden boy out of handcuffs. The sheer scale of the betrayal was staggering. My parents had always been toxic. They had always favored Brandon, funded his lifestyle, and dismissed my achievements. But this was a terrifying escalation. They had crossed the line from terrible parenting into active, organized criminal conspiracy. They looked at my $36 million company and did not see their daughter's hard work. They saw a get-out-of-jail-free card for their felon of a son. I am so incredibly disgusted, Jasmine said, her voice shaking with raw revulsion. I married into this family believing in the image your parents projected. The country club dinners, the charity galas, the perfect suburban facade. It is all a rotting, toxic lie. I look at Brandon now, and I do not see a husband or a father. I see a parasite who was willing to leave his own children homeless to cover his gambling addiction. And I look at your parents and see enablers who would gladly throw us both to the wolves to protect him. Jasmine stood up and began pacing the length of my office. Her energy was electric, fueled by a mother's instinct to protect her young. I want a divorce, Olivia, Jasmine declared, turning to face me. I want full custody of my children. I want to completely sever myself from the radioactive wasteland that is your family. I refuse to let my kids grow up watching their father lie, cheat, and steal while their grandparents applaud him for it. I am taking my children, my real estate career, and my sanity, and I am walking away. If you file for divorce right now, I warned her calmly, and you report the forgery, the bank will still seize the house. Brandon will go to prison, but you will still be evicted. The foreclosure process does not stop just because one spouse committed a felony against the other. The lenders will take the property, liquidate it, and you will be left fighting a lengthy legal battle while trying to find a new home for your kids. Jasmine stopped pacing. She looked at me, the harsh reality of the legal system momentarily dampening her righteous anger. Then what do? I cannot stay married to a felon, and I cannot let him drag my children into poverty. You do not stay married to him, I assured her, standing up and walking over to where she stood. But you also do not play your hand yet. My parents and Brandon think they are the only ones playing a strategic game. They think they can bully and extort their way out of a federal crime. We are going to let them keep believing that. I walked back to my desk and picked up the drafted agreement. I tossed it directly into the trash can. The pieces of the board were visible now. I finally knew exactly how to position them. My parents and my brother had declared war, assuming I would fight completely fair. They had absolutely no idea I was about to rewrite the entire rulebook tonight. I smiled at Jasmine with pure resolve. Section 9, 1,000 words. I smiled at Jasmine with pure resolve. If you walk out on him today, I explained, leaning against my desk, Brandon will panic. My parents will realize you know about the forged mortgage. They will go into damage control mode, hire a defense attorney, drain whatever cash they have left to secure legal protection, and leave you holding the bag for the defaulted loan. You will lose the house, and they will drag out divorce proceedings for years to punish you. Jasmine swallowed hard, her dark eyes flashing with a mixture of terror and outrage. So what is the alternative? I go back to that massive house and willingly sleep next to a man who committed a federal crime against me. I pretend to smile warmly at your parents while they actively plot to destroy your company to save their criminal son. Yes, I stated, my voice completely unwavering. That is exactly what you are going to do. You are going to be the most supportive, incredibly oblivious wife Brandon has ever had. You are going to be my Trojan horse. Jasmine stared at me, the audacity of the plan registering in her dark eyes. The fear was gone now, replaced by the calculating intellect of a real estate broker who understood high-stakes negotiations. My parents are desperate, I continued, pacing slowly. Desperate people make sloppy mistakes, but they are also incredibly arrogant. They think of you as just Brandon's beautiful wife, a supporting character in their drama. They will never suspect you of orchestrating their downfall. What exactly do you need me to do? Jasmine asked, her tone shifting into pure business mode. I need undeniable bulletproof evidence of their systemic financial crimes, I told her. Harrison and I can squeeze them legally, but to obliterate their leverage we need internal records. My father operates his distribution company like a mafia boss. He keeps physical copies of his illicit ledgers, tax documents, and shadow accounts in the safe inside his home office. He also keeps the corporate pension fund records there. Jasmine nodded her mind, working through logistics. Richard's home office is always locked, but Patricia keeps a spare brass key in the false bottom of her jewelry box. She showed it to me once when she needed me to retrieve a necklace. They think I am clueless about their finances. They will not change their security habits around me. Perfect, I said. You need to access that office when they are out. You cannot take physical documents. If anything goes missing, they will shred the rest. You need to photograph everything. I walked to a secure cabinet, unlocked it, and pulled out an unregistered smartphone. I powered it on and handed it to her. This is a sterile device, I explained. It has no connection to your personal data or their home network. It only runs on an encrypted virtual private network. I installed a single document scanning application on it. Every time you photograph a ledger, the file is instantly uploaded to an offshore cloud server that only Harrison and I can access. The moment the upload completes, the file deletes itself from the device. If Brandon finds the phone, it will look empty. Jasmine took the phone. I can do this. Brandon spends every afternoon at his sports club. Patricia leaves the house every Tuesday and Thursday for charity luncheons. The house is completely empty for 3 hours on those days. You have to be meticulous, I warned her. We need proof of tax evasion and embezzlement. My parents are using their business to launder money to keep Brandon afloat. We are going to map out their financial facade, trace every stolen dollar, and build a legal trap with absolutely no loopholes. When we spring it, they will not have a single avenue of escape. What is the ultimate endgame, Olivia? Jasmine asked, gripping the sterile phone tightly in her hands. I need to know my children will be safe when the explosion happens. The endgame is total financial annihilation for them and complete unbreakable security for you, I promised her. Harrison and I are preparing a massive corporate maneuver behind the scenes. Once we have the internal ledgers, I will have the immediate leverage to force a hostile takeover of their distribution company. We will legally strip them of all their assets. When the dust finally settles, I will ensure the Oakbrook house is transferred directly into a protected trust exclusively for you and your children. Brandon will be left with absolutely nothing and facing federal indictment. Jasmine let out a long, slow breath. The sheer magnitude of the strategy was immense, but she did not flinch. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a compact mirror, and carefully wiped away the remaining traces of her tears. She smoothed her immaculate suit jacket and lifted her chin proudly. The terrified victim had vanished entirely, replaced by a ruthless operative ready to dismantle her abusers from the inside out. "I am going to destroy him," Jasmine said softly, her voice carrying a cold, lethal promise. "For every single lie he told me, for putting my children at severe financial risk, I am going to tear his entire life down." "We are going to tear it down together," I corrected her smoothly. "Go home. Comfort him when he complains endlessly about me. Let them think their extortion plan is working perfectly. Buy us the exact time we need to arm the warhead." Jasmine stood up, slipping the sterile phone safely into a hidden compartment of her handbag. She walked toward the heavy oak door of my office, pausing just before turning the brass handle. She looked back at me, a fierce, unbreakable alliance now permanently forged between us. She gave me a single determined nod, and then stepped out into the hallway, heading straight back into the lion's den. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the quiet hum of my executive office. I walked over to the windows, pulled the blinds open, and stared out at the freezing Chicago skyline. The game had fundamentally shifted. Over the next 3 weeks, Jasmine executed her role with a level of theatrical brilliance that left me genuinely awestruck. She returned to the sprawling Oakbrook estate that very afternoon and immediately slipped back into her carefully curated persona. When Brandon complained about my supposed greed, she rubbed his shoulders and offered him sympathetic affirmations. When Patricia ranted about my lack of family loyalty, Jasmine poured her a glass of expensive Chardonnay and nodded in absolute agreement. They bought her performance entirely. To them, she was merely an extension of Brandon, a pretty accessory who lacked the intellect to understand their complex financial maneuvers. That arrogance became their fatal vulnerability. Jasmine struck for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon. Brandon had left for his exclusive sports club to play squash, burning money they did not actually have, while Patricia was attending a high society charity luncheon downtown. Richard was occupied at the distribution company warehouse, leaving the massive estate completely empty. Jasmine moved swiftly. She walked into the master bedroom, opened Patricia's ornate jewelry box, lifted the velvet false bottom, and retrieved the small brass key. Within seconds, she unlocked the heavy door to Richard's private home office. She locked it behind her, ensuring she would not be caught off guard if someone returned unexpectedly. She pulled the sterile smartphone from her handbag and went to work. Richard kept his most sensitive financial ledgers in a fireproof safe, but he carelessly left the current quarter's operational documents stacked on his mahogany desk. Jasmine used the custom scanning application exactly as I had instructed. She photographed tax returns, bank statements, and internal corporate memos. Each time she snapped a photo, the encrypted file instantly vanished from the device, uploading directly to the secure offshore server Harrison and I monitored. Sitting in my penthouse late at night, I reviewed the incoming data streams alongside Harrison. The first few uploads confirmed what we already suspected regarding massive corporate debt and blatant tax evasion. My father was expensing Brandon's luxury vehicles, designer suits, and lavish vacations as fraudulent operational costs. He was actively writing off his son's gambling addiction as business development. But by the second week of Jasmine's covert operation, the documents shifted from simple tax fraud to something infinitely more sinister. Jasmine had finally cracked the combination to the fireproof safe by observing the wear pattern on the keypad. The files she extracted from that safe made my blood run absolutely cold. I sat in Harrison's office, staring at the projected images on his conference screen, feeling a wave of pure disgust. My parents were not just defrauding the federal government, they were systematically embezzling money directly from the retirement accounts of their own employees. The distribution company maintained a pension fund for its warehouse workers, drivers, and logistics staff, people who broke their backs loading trucks in the freezing cold for decades to earn a modest retirement. Richard and Patricia had set up a complex series of shell companies to siphon cash out of that exact pension fund. They were actively draining the life savings of their loyal workforce to quietly pay off Brandon's offshore gambling syndicates and his forged second mortgage. It was a staggering level of depravity. They were willing to destroy the financial security of 80 innocent working-class families just to protect their golden child from facing the consequences of his own felonies. This is a federal crime, Harrison said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper as he reviewed the ledger transfers. This violates the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. If the Department of Labor sees these documents, your father will face decades in a federal penitentiary. Your mother will join him. This is not just a civil lawsuit anymore, Olivia. This is an absolute criminal enterprise. I felt a dark, lethal satisfaction settling in my chest. We had them. Jasmine had delivered the ultimate weapon. We had meticulously gathered an arsenal of undeniable bulletproof evidence that could instantly obliterate my family's entire existence. I instructed Harrison to begin preparing the hostile takeover documents. I was going to use these stolen pension ledgers as the ultimate leverage to seize total control of their distribution company, liquidate their assets, restore the employees' retirement funds, and leave my parents and Brandon with absolutely nothing. We were perfectly positioned to execute the kill shot. We spent the next 4 days finalizing the corporate acquisition trap. Everything was ready, but just as I was preparing to signal Jasmine to pack her bags and pull her children out of the Oak Brook house, the war took a sudden, violent turn. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the final draft of the takeover demand when Harrison burst through my office door. He did not knock. His usual composed, predatory demeanor was entirely gone, replaced by a look of sheer urgency. He slammed a massive stack of legal filings onto my desk. "Your father just struck first," Harrison announced, his voice tight with alarm. "Richard officially filed a massive lawsuit against you in federal court this morning. He is claiming that the core code of your software platform is the intellectual property of his distribution company. He claims you developed it using his corporate resources and his funding." I stared at the thick legal binder in disbelief. "And worse," Harrison continued, leaning over the desk. "He just requested an immediate emergency injunction to freeze every single one of your corporate and personal assets. If the federal judge actually signs that specific legal order today, your entire company will be completely paralyzed. We will not be able to process payroll, access the secure banking servers, or finalize the upcoming venture capital funding round. We are completely out of time right now." "We are not out of time," I replied, my voice slicing through Harrison's rare moment of panic. "File an immediate counter-motion. Remind the federal judge that freezing the assets of a $36 million enterprise with 80 employees based on a baseless intellectual property claim will cause irreparable economic harm. Force a hearing." Harrison nodded, his predatory composure snapping back into place. Within 2 hours, his legal team flooded the federal docket with emergency counterfilings. The federal judge, annoyed by the sudden eruption of high-stakes corporate warfare on his desk, refused to sign my father's asset freeze. Instead, the judge issued a strict mandate. He ordered all parties into a mandatory binding mediation session to resolve the intellectual property dispute before he would allow the lawsuit to proceed to open court. We were given exactly 48 hours to prepare. The mediation took place in a sterile, glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of a neutral legal facility in downtown Chicago. A massive, polished granite table dominated the space. Harrison and I arrived early. I wore a tailored midnight blue suit, my hair pulled back into a severe twist, projecting absolute impenetrable authority. Harrison sat beside me, his briefcase resting on the table like a loaded weapon. At exactly 10 in the morning, the heavy glass doors opened. My family walked in. My father entered first, wearing a custom suit that was undoubtedly paid for by his employees' stolen pension funds. My mother followed, dressed in modest, understated beige, clutching a tissue. Brandon walked in last, exuding a repulsive level of arrogance. He swaggered to the table, pulling out his chair with an exaggerated sigh, acting as if this multi-million-dollar extortion attempt was a tedious interruption to his busy schedule. Jasmine was not with them, playing her part perfectly by staying home. The mediator was a retired federal judge named Elias, a man known for having little patience for corporate games. He activated the official recording device in the center of the table, stating the date the parties present and the nature of the intellectual property dispute. The moment the red recording light clicked on, my mother launched into her performance. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Patricia pressed the tissue to her eyes, forcing tears to spill over her carefully applied makeup. She spoke directly to the mediator, her voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak. She spun a tragic tale of a family business that had given everything to support a rebellious, troubled daughter. She claimed that my father had mentored me, funded my education, and provided the proprietary logistics data that formed the backbone of my software platform. She wept as she described how my sudden wealth had corrupted my morals, turning me against the very people who had loved and nurtured me. I did not interrupt her. I did not roll my eyes, cross my arms, or display a single ounce of defensive body language. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting flat on the granite table, my face a mask of stone. I maintained unblinking eye contact with my mother as she lied on the official mediation record. In a normal family conflict, this was the exact moment where the victim would break. They would start screaming, defending themselves desperately, trying to correct the false narrative. But I knew the absolute rules of legal combat. Every single lie Patricia told was being recorded. Every fraudulent claim she established on the record was another nail in her own coffin. By remaining absolutely silent, I was giving them enough rope to hang themselves. The mediator took diligent notes, his expression remaining neutral, though I could tell Patricia's tears were having an effect. He gently asked my father to elaborate on the intellectual property claims. My father recited a fabricated story about how my software code was developed on his company time, using his warehouse logistics models as a testing ground. But Brandon could not stand letting our parents command the spotlight for too long. He leaned forward aggressively, interjecting himself into the proceedings. He pointed a finger at me, his face twisted in a familiar sneer. Brandon officially entered his demands onto the record. He reiterated his absurd claim about the 10-year-old laptop, stating it was the foundational seed capital of my entire enterprise. Then, emboldened by my continued silence, he decided to push his luck. He claimed that my refusal to recognize his co-founder status had caused him severe emotional distress. He stated on the official audio recording that my actions had nearly destroyed his marriage and driven him to the brink of financial ruin. "We are not asking for much," Brandon stated, looking at the mediator with a sickeningly earnest expression. "We just want what is fair." Originally, I offered to settle this dispute for a simple transfer of 40% equity or a cash buyout of $17 million. But given the severe emotional trauma my sister has maliciously inflicted upon me and my parents over the past week, and the immense legal fees we have been forced to incur just to claim what is rightfully ours, that number is no longer sufficient. I am officially updating our settlement demand. We require a flat, immediate cash buyout of $20 million. If she signs the transfer today, we will drop the intellectual property lawsuit and walk away. If she refuses, we will drag this out in federal court until her company is completely bankrupt. The sheer audacity of the demand hung in the air. $20 million. Brandon had just documented a textbook extortion attempt on a legally binding audio recording. He sat back in his chair, folding his arms behind his head, looking at me with a triumphant grin. He honestly believed he had won. He thought my silence was the silence of a defeated woman who had finally realized she was cornered. The mediator looked down at his legal notepad with absolute disgust. Clearly preparing to reprimand my brother for his extortion attempt. Before the judge could speak, Harrison raised his hand. The slight gesture commanded the room. Harrison unlocked his leather briefcase. The metallic clicks echoed sharply in the silent room, sounding like the cocking of a loaded weapon. He withdrew a meticulously organized stack of documents bound in red folders and placed them squarely on the granite table. Judge Elias. Harrison began, his voice a lethal baritone. We are not here to negotiate. We are here to enter into the record undeniable proof that this lawsuit is a malicious extortion attempt. The plaintiffs are not seeking compensation for stolen code. They are desperately attempting to secure $20 million to cover up a massive federal criminal enterprise. My mother gasped, clutching her throat. My father shifted violently, his face draining pure white. Brandon stared at the folders, his smug grin melting into confusion. That is actionable defamation, my father shouted, pointing a trembling finger. You cannot make baseless accusations on an official record. I never make baseless accusations, Harrison replied coldly. He opened the first folder and slid a real estate document toward the mediator. Let us begin with Brandon. 18 months ago, Brandon secured an $800,000 second mortgage on his primary residence through a shadow lender. He lacked the consent of his wife Jasmine, the legal co-owner of the property. Instead, he committed federal wire fraud and identity theft by forging her signature on the loan documents in the presence of a compromised notary. Brandon choked on his breath. He scrambled backward, his eyes darting frantically toward the glass doors as if calculating his escape. Jasmine discovered this financial felony. Harrison continued, pinning Brandon with his gaze. She provided the original origination documents, certified signature samples, and digital logs, proving Brandon orchestrated the forgery to funnel cash into illegal offshore gambling syndicates. He lost every cent. That loan is in default. The shadow lenders execute foreclosure on January 10th. Brandon is weeks away from homelessness and facing 30 years in a federal penitentiary for bank fraud. The mediator scanned the forged signatures and the forensic analysis. The judge's expression hardened into granite. He looked at Brandon with absolute revulsion. This is a desperate smear campaign, my mother shrieked, slamming her palms on the table. You are twisting family financial matters to avoid paying my son what he rightfully deserves. You will not drag his name through the mud. Harrison did not even look at her. He simply opened the second red folder. He pulled out a massive stack of internal accounting ledgers, tax returns, and corporate bank statements. He pushed the entire stack across the table. Your son's wire fraud is merely the appetizer, Harrison stated, his voice slicing through my mother's hysterics like a scalpel. When Patricia and Richard discovered their son was facing federal indictment for the forged mortgage, they did not hold him accountable. Instead, they actively conspired to bail him out. But their distribution company was already drowning in hidden corporate debt. They had no liquid capital, so they decided to steal it from the people who trusted them the most. My father stood up, his chair crashing backward against the glass wall. Do not say another word, he roared, pure panic radiating from his entire body. I demand this mediation be terminated immediately. We are leaving. Sit down, the mediator commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. The sheer authority in the retired judge's tone forced my father back into his seat, his knees trembling uncontrollably. Patricia and Richard, Harrison continued. His eyes locked onto my parents, systematically embezzled over $1 million directly from their own employees' retirement pension fund. They established a complex network of shell companies to quietly siphon the life savings of their warehouse workers and logistics staff. They committed severe violations of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. They committed massive tax evasion by expensing Brandon's gambling debts and luxury lifestyle as fraudulent operational costs. They actively drained the retirement security of 80 innocent, hardworking families just to keep their felon son out of handcuffs. Harrison tapped the stack of ledgers. We have the internal routing numbers. We have the hidden bank accounts. We have the exact dates of every single illegal transfer. Every piece of paper in this room was acquired legally from the inside. Your entire distribution company is a rotting criminal enterprise running on stolen pension funds. The silence in the conference room was absolute and terrifying. The air felt suffocatingly heavy. My mother sat frozen, her mouth open in a silent scream of pure terror. My father clutched his chest, his breathing rapid and shallow, realizing that his entire life was over. Brandon sat completely paralyzed, staring at the table as if the documents were actively burning him. They realized the embezzled funds were not enough to cover the massive balloon payments on their own corporate debt and Brandon's shadow loan, Harrison concluded, turning his attention fully to the stunned mediator. They faced total financial annihilation, so they targeted my client. They orchestrated a violent confrontation on Christmas Eve to extort $17 million from her. When she refused, they fabricated this intellectual property lawsuit. They attempted to freeze the assets of her $36 million software platform, hoping to force a quick cash settlement before their own lenders seize their assets. They are using the federal court system to execute a $20 million extortion plot to cover up a multi-million-dollar federal embezzlement scheme. The mediator slowly lowered his pen. He looked at my parents and my brother, his face a portrait of profound judicial fury. He reached out and pressed the button on the recording device, ensuring every single word of Harrison's presentation was permanently etched into the official legal record. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. There was no escape. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. There was no escape. The mediator leaned forward, his face pale with revulsion, and pressed a heavy silver button on the recording console. The harsh mechanical beep echoed through the glass conference room like a final gunshot. He stared directly at my parents with an expression of unadulterated contempt. I have mediated complex corporate disputes for 25 years. The retired judge stated, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. I have seen immense greed. I have seen calculated deception. But I have never witnessed a family attempt to utilize the federal court system as a shield for a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme against their own employees. He closed his leather-bound legal pad with a definitive, aggressive snap. This mediation is over. The plaintiff's intellectual property claims are entirely baseless and fraudulent. I am terminating these proceedings immediately, and I am formally referring the financial evidence presented in this room to the United States Attorney's Office. You are not walking out of here with a $20 million settlement. You are walking out of here directly into a massive federal criminal investigation. The crushing reality of the judge's words finally penetrated the dense armor of my parents' immense arrogance. The absolute panic did not arrive gradually. It struck them like a violent physical blow. My father, Richard, was the first to physically break. He grabbed his chest, his thick fingers frantically clawing at the expensive fabric of his custom-tailored suit. His face, previously flushed with victorious rage, rapidly drained to a sickly, translucent shade of gray. He began to gasp loudly, his breath catching in his throat in harsh, ragged wheezes. He stumbled backward, his knees completely giving out, and he collapsed heavily into his large leather chair. He clutched the sharp edge of the polished granite table, desperately trying to pull oxygen into his failing lungs, his eyes wide with the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man watching his entire life vaporize in seconds. I cannot breathe. My father wheezed, his voice reduced to a pathetic, rattling croak. Patricia, I cannot catch my breath. But my mother did not even look at him. She did not reach out a single hand to comfort her husband of 35 years. Patricia's survival instinct was entirely feral, and right now she fully realized the ship was rapidly sinking. She looked at the stacked red folders containing the stolen pension records, then turned her head slowly to look at Brandon. The long-standing illusion of the perfect, loyal family completely disintegrated in the span of a single heartbeat. You did this, Patricia hissed. The warm maternal affection she had faked just moments ago vanished entirely. Her face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, vicious hatred. She pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at Brandon's face. You parasite. You absolute worthless parasite. You ruined us. Brandon recoiled violently as if she had physically slapped him across the face. Me? He yelled, his voice cracking with panic. You were the ones who moved the money. You signed off on the corporate transfers. You told me it was handled. We moved that money to save you from federal prison, you complete idiot. My mother screamed, her voice reaching a hysterical, ear-piercing pitch. She slammed her bare hands onto the table, leaning aggressively toward her former golden child. We risked everything. We risked the company. We risked our entire retirement to cover up your disgusting gambling addiction. We bailed you out of your miserably failed crypto businesses over again. We bought your house. We paid your credit cards. And you still managed to forge your wife's signature and get yourself targeted by offshore lenders. You dragged us into the mud with you. I never asked you to steal from the pension fund, Brandon roared back, completely abandoning any lingering pretense of familial respect. You made that choice. You were the ones committing tax fraud for years before I even took that loan. Do not put your federal crimes on me, Mom. If the feds come knocking, I will tell them exactly who orchestrated those illegal shell companies today. I will turn state's evidence against both of you in a heartbeat to save myself. My mother let out a sound that was half scream, half growl. She lunged across the granite table, her manicured hands actively clawing at Brandon's suit jacket. I will kill you myself, she shrieked, entirely losing her mind. I gave up my entire life for you. I sacrificed my relationship with my own daughter to protect your fragile ego. I enabled your pathetic, lazy existence because you were too weak to survive in the real world. You are a massive, humiliating failure, Brandon. Brandon violently shoved her hands away, his face purple with rage. You created me! He screamed right back at her, spittle flying from his lips. You told me I was a genius. You handed me money every time I asked. You taught me that rules did not apply to me. You are a toxic, suffocating enabler. You and Dad built this entire criminal mess because you cared more about your country club reputation than running a legitimate business. Down at the far end of the table, my father slipped out of his chair entirely. He hit the carpeted floor. He landed with a heavy thud, aggressively pulling at his collar, his lips turning a faint shade of blue. He was experiencing a full-blown panic attack, drowning in a sea of adrenaline and terror. He reached a trembling hand up toward the table, silently begging for help. Patricia, he gasped, his eyes rolling back slightly. Please. My mother looked down at him with absolute disgust. Shut up, Richard, she snapped coldly. Your gross incompetence caused this. If you had just managed the business correctly, we would not be sitting here facing federal indictment. I sat perfectly still, watching the toxic carnage unfold. I felt absolutely nothing. The mediator immediately reached for the intercom on the granite table, buzzing the front desk to call for paramedics. Harrison calmly closed his red folders, the sharp snapping of the clasps cutting through my father's ragged wheezing. I stood up, smoothing the front of my midnight blue suit. I did not spare a single glance for the man gasping on the floor, nor did I acknowledge my mother and brother, who were still locked in a vicious verbal deathmatch. We are leaving, I told Harrison. My mother snapped her head toward me. You cannot just walk out, she screamed, abandoning her fight with Brandon to lunge toward my side of the table. You have to fix this, Olivia. You have $36 million. You can pay back the pension fund before the federal investigators audit the distribution company. If you walk out that door, your father goes to prison. Then he better hire a good defense attorney, I replied, my voice chillingly devoid of empathy. I am not spending a single cent of my company's capital to subsidize your federal crimes. You made your choices. Now you will get to live the rest of your life paying for them. Harrison picked up his briefcase. I highly suggest you retain white-collar criminal counsel immediately, Patricia. The Department of Labor does not negotiate. Without another word, Harrison and I walked out of the glass conference room. We left them trapped in their own self-made destruction. The intellectual property lawsuit was effectively dead, but the war was not entirely over yet. I knew my parents. They were cornered rats, and cornered rats are exceptionally dangerous. They would not just blindly surrender to a federal indictment and financial ruin without exhausting every single predatory avenue available to them. Over the next 48 hours, my prediction proved accurate. Richard survived his panic attack, released from the hospital with a terrifying reality check. The clock was ticking. Jasmine fed me updates through encrypted messages. My parents and Brandon were in a state of frantic desperation. They knew the mediator was obligated to report the pension embezzlement. They knew the offshore lenders holding Brandon's forged second mortgage were preparing to execute the foreclosure on the Oakbrook property. They needed cash immediately to replace the stolen employee retirement funds and pay off the illegal loan before the authorities ripped their lives apart. They went to traditional banks first. They were laughed out of every single executive loan office in Chicago. Their credit was radioactive. The distribution company was drowning in toxic debt, and their assets were heavily leveraged. Patricia grew increasingly hysterical, terrified of losing her sprawling mansion and her elite country club status. She began reaching out to shadow lenders, private equity firms known for predatory interest rates and aggressive collateral demands. That is exactly when they found Apex Holdings. Apex Holdings appeared on their radar like a miraculous beacon of salvation. It presented itself as an aggressive private equity firm willing to fund high-risk corporate bailouts. The terms were absolutely brutal. Apex offered a bridge loan large enough to cover the embezzled pension funds and Brandon's $800,000 forged mortgage. However, the interest rates were astronomical and the collateral requirements were absolute. To secure the funding, Richard and Patricia had to sign over the total controlling shares of their distribution company. They also had to put up their personal mansion as collateral. Brandon had to sign away any remaining equity in the Oak Brook house. They were signing away their entire existence, placing their heads directly into a financial guillotine. But they were so blinded by the immediate terror of federal prison that they did not hesitate. Jasmine reported that my father wept with relief when the preliminary term sheet arrived. My mother celebrated by pouring a glass of expensive champagne, praising her own brilliant business acumen for finding a willing investor at the 11th hour. They genuinely believed they had outsmarted everyone. They thought they had successfully covered up the federal crimes, saved their precious golden child from incarceration, and preserved their wealthy suburban facade. The arrogance returned almost instantly. The paralyzing fear that had gripped them in the mediation room evaporated, replaced by their typical suffocating narcissism. On Friday evening, my phone illuminated with a new voicemail. It was from Patricia. I played it on speakerphone in my penthouse, listening to her triumphant tone. "Well, Olivia," my mother gloated, her voice laced with supreme condescension. "I suppose you thought you had destroyed us. You thought we would come crawling back to you begging for your little software money. But you severely underestimated this family. We just secured a massive capital injection from serious high-level private equity investors. They looked at our distribution company and saw immense value, something you were always too blind and selfish to see. We are paying off your brother's debts, and we are expanding. We do not need you. We never needed you. You can keep your pennies. We are moving on to bigger and better things." The voicemail clicked off. I sat at my kitchen island, staring at the Chicago skyline, and let out a soft, dark laugh. The sheer blinding ignorance was almost poetic. Patricia and Richard were currently popping champagne, toasting to their miraculous salvation. They were celebrating the shadow firm that had just handed them a lifeline. They had no idea. They did not research the corporate structure of their saviors. They did not dig into the anonymous holding companies shielding the private equity firm's true ownership. If they had, they would have realized the catastrophic fatal error they had just made. Apex Holdings was not a random equity group. I created Apex Holdings. I funded it entirely with the profits from my software platform. They did not outsmart me. They had just legally signed over every single thing they owned directly to me. The luxurious glass-walled offices of Apex Holdings occupied the entire top floor of one of Chicago's most prestigious skyscrapers. The reception area was an intimidating expanse of polished marble minimalist art and floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. A meticulously groomed receptionist directed my family to the executive boardroom. Richard, Patricia, and Brandon walked with a renewed swagger. The terror of the mediation room had been completely overwritten by the arrogant confidence of people who believed they had just pulled off the financial heist of the century. They had the signed transfer documents in hand, ready to officially hand over their entire distribution company and their personal real estate as collateral to the shadowy equity firm. They believed they were saving themselves. They entered the massive boardroom. The room was dominated by a 50-foot custom walnut table surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs. The atmosphere was deliberately cold and intimidating. At the far end of the table, a single high-backed leather executive chair was turned away from the door, facing the spectacular view of the Chicago skyline. A sleek silver nameplate sat on the polished wood surface, simply reading Founder and Chief Executive Officer. "We are here for the final signing," my father announced to the empty room, his voice booming with forced authority. "We have the executed collateral agreements for the bridge loan. Let us get this done so we can initiate the wire transfers today." The leather chair did not move. "Excuse me?" Brandon chimed in, stepping further into the room, clearly irritated by the lack of a red carpet reception. "My father is speaking to you. We are the principals of the distribution company. We are here to close the bailout package with Apex Holdings." My mother, sensing the unusual silence, stepped closer to Richard. She smoothed the front of her designer dress, her eyes narrowing at the back of the chair. "I must say this is highly unprofessional," Patricia remarked, her tone dripping with entitlement. "We expect to be greeted properly considering the magnitude of the assets we are bringing to your firm." I let the silence stretch for exactly 10 more seconds. I let them steep in their own arrogance, letting them savor their final moments of perceived victory. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I placed my hands on the armrests and swiveled the heavy leather chair around to face them. I did not smile. I did not speak. I simply sat there, dressed in an immaculate razor-sharp white pantsuit, my hands steepled beneath my chin. I met their gaze with absolute unyielding coldness. The physical reaction was instantaneous and profoundly satisfying. My father stopped breathing entirely, his mouth hanging open in a silent, grotesque gasp. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. Brandon staggered backward, actually colliding with the glass door behind him, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it was almost primal. My mother, the grand orchestrator of all this misery, let out a sound that was less of a scream and more of a strangled, animalistic wheeze. She clutched the edge of the conference table, her knees visibly buckling beneath her. "What? What are you doing here?" my father stammered, his voice reduced to a pathetic, trembling whisper. "Where is the CEO of Apex Holdings?" I leaned forward slowly, resting my forearms on the mahogany table. "You are looking at her, Richard." "No!" Brandon yelled, shaking his head violently, his denial so desperate it bordered on delusion. "No, this is a joke. This is a setup. Apex Holdings is a private equity firm. We dealt with a team of investment bankers. We negotiated a massive bridge loan." "You negotiated with my employees, Brandon." I clarified, my voice slicing through the room like a perfectly honed blade. "I established Apex Holdings exactly 12 months ago. I seeded it entirely with the operational profits from my software platform. It is a specialized aggressive debt acquisition vehicle designed specifically to purchase distressed toxic corporate debt. Your distribution company checked every single box." My mother stumbled forward, her designer heels clicking erratically against the hardwood floor. She leaned over the table, her face twisted in a mask of absolute horror and denial. "You cannot be Apex. We signed over everything. We gave them the company shares. We gave them the Oak Brook house. We gave them this mansion." "You gave it all to me, Patricia," I stated, locking my eyes onto hers. "Every single piece of collateral you signed over to secure that bailout loan now legally belongs to Apex Holdings, which means, as the sole owner and primary shareholder of Apex, I now own your entire distribution company. I own your sprawling suburban mansion. I own Brandon's house. I hold the paper on every single asset you possess." The reality of the situation finally breached their defenses. It was not a joke. It was not a trick. It was a legally binding, meticulously executed corporate takeover. They had literally handed me the keys to their entire existence in exchange for a loan they could never possibly repay. "You cannot do this!" my father roared, slamming his fist onto the table. But the power behind his anger was entirely gone. He sounded like a terrified, broken man. "This is entrapment. It is fraud. We will sue you. We will take this to federal court." "You will do absolutely nothing," I countered, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. Because if you challenge the legality of this loan agreement, you will be forced to publicly disclose exactly why you needed the bailout money in the first place. You will have to explain to a federal judge that you needed my cash to cover up a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme against your own employee's pension fund. You will have to admit that Brandon committed wire fraud and forgery to secure a shadow mortgage. If you fight me, you all go to federal prison. I am the only thing standing between you and an indictment. They were completely trapped. The sheer magnitude of their own arrogance had led them directly into an inescapable cage. They had thought they were outsmarting me, avoiding my terms, securing funding from a neutral third party. Instead, they had willingly walked into the slaughterhouse and handed me the executioner's blade. "You set us up," my father gasped, his hands gripping the edge of the conference table as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from beneath him. "I did not set you up, Richard," I replied calmly, leaning back in my executive chair. "I merely anticipated your exact behavior. You are entirely predictable. When cornered, you rely on arrogance instead of due diligence. You thought you could outsmart a federal indictment by jumping into bed with a shadow equity firm. You never bothered to look at the holding company structures behind Apex because you were too desperate to save your own skin." I picked up a sleek black remote and pressed a button. The frosted glass wall behind me transformed into a massive digital display, illuminating the dark room with complex financial flowcharts and corporate organizational trees. "Let me explain exactly how you arrived at your own execution," I said, gesturing to the screen. 12 months ago, my software platform finalized a massive enterprise contract that generated an extraordinary amount of liquid capital. I did not need to reinvest all of it into my primary company, so I established Apex Holdings. It was designed as a specialized acquisition vehicle operating entirely through blind trusts and offshore registered agents. My name appears nowhere on the public filings. The sole purpose of Apex was to acquire distressed corporate debt. I pressed the remote again. The screen zoomed in on a specific branch of the corporate tree, displaying the logo of my parents' distribution company. "You see, Dad, I knew your company was failing long before Jasmine brought me the documents from your safe. Your cash flow problems were an open secret in the logistics industry, so Apex quietly stepped into the secondary market. Over the past year, we have been purchasing your outstanding commercial loans from your creditors. We bought the paper on your warehouse mortgages. We bought your unpaid supplier invoices. We bought every single piece of high-interest debt you desperately accumulated to cover Brandon's lavish failures." My father looked like he was going to be sick. He turned his head, staring at the screen with hollow, defeated eyes. "You did not just secure a bailout loan today," I clarified, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "You consolidated all of your distressed debt under one single creditor, Apex Holdings. By signing those bridge loan documents this morning, you triggered a cross-default consolidation clause. You handed over your entire distribution company. Every truck, every warehouse, every single piece of inventory now legally belongs to me. You cannot take the company," my mother cried out, her voice cracking with raw panic. "It is our entire livelihood. We built that business from the ground up. You are our daughter. You cannot just strip us of everything we own." "I am not your daughter anymore, Patricia," I stated, my gaze locking onto hers with absolute freezing finality. "I stopped being your daughter the moment you threw me out in the snow to protect a felon. I stopped being your daughter when you tried to extort $17 million from me to cover up a federal crime. I am no longer your child. I am your sole creditor. I am the owner of your entire livelihood. I hold the deed to every single thing you value in this world." Brandon, who had been standing paralyzed against the glass door, suddenly lunged forward. "My house!" he yelled, his face twisted in a mask of pure terror. "You said you took the collateral. You took the Oak Brook house." I turned my attention to my brother, savoring the absolute destruction of his unearned arrogance. I pressed the remote one final time. The screen shifted to display the property deed and the forged second mortgage documents. "Yes, Brandon," I said, offering him a sharp, predatory smile. "Let us talk about your house. The shadow lender who held the $800,000 loan you secured by forging Jasmine's signature Apex Holdings bought that specific debt portfolio 2 weeks ago." When you signed the bailout agreement this morning, you officially surrendered any remaining equity you had in that property to satisfy the consolidation. Brandon's knees buckled. He grabbed the back of an empty leather chair to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. You do not own that house, I told him, enunciating every single syllable for maximum impact. You do not have a home. I am your landlord. And because you are currently in default on the original fraudulent loan, I have already initiated the eviction process. You have exactly 0 legal rights to that property. And my house, my mother whispered, her hands shaking violently as she covered her mouth. The estate. Collateralized, I confirmed without an ounce of pity. You pledged your primary residence to secure the bridge loan. It belongs to the Apex asset portfolio now. If you fail to meet the immediate repayment terms, which we all know is mathematically impossible, I will foreclose on the mansion by the end of the month. You will be completely homeless. My father buried his face in his hands. A low, pathetic sob escaped his throat. The great patriarch, the man who had mocked my initial business plan and refused to co-sign a $5,000 loan, was now completely broken, weeping in my boardroom. You are a monster! My mother screamed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. We are your family. We gave you life. You are destroying your own blood for what revenge? You are a sick, vindictive monster. I am a businesswoman, I corrected her smoothly. A very successful one. You taught me that family is a transactional concept. You taught me that love is conditional on financial compliance. I simply learned this lesson and applied it to the open market. You brought a pathetic, fraudulent extortion plot to a corporate war. You tried to play a game you did not understand and you lost absolutely everything. You brought a pathetic, fraudulent extortion plot to a corporate war. You tried to play a game you did not understand and you lost absolutely everything. My parents sat frozen, unable to process the absolute devastation of their reality. They were no longer the powerful, untouchable upper-middle-class patriarch and matriarch. They were simply desperate, bankrupt individuals sitting in the boardroom of the person who owned their entire existence. The shift in power was so complete, so instantaneous that it seemed to strip the very oxygen from the air. This is illegal! Brandon suddenly screamed, his voice cracking as he slammed his hands onto the mahogany table. You cannot just take my house, Olivia. I have rights. I have a family. You do not have a family, Brandon, I said softly, the words landing with the precision of a sniper's bullet. You have a wife who just filed for full custody of your children this morning. Jasmine filed the divorce papers an hour ago. She also filed a formal police report regarding the $800,000 second mortgage you secured by forging her signature. Brandon's face contorted in a mixture of shock and sheer panic. He stumbled backward, his knees giving out as he collapsed into a leather chair. The realization that his entire safety net had vanished hit him like a physical blow. He was not just losing his house, he was losing his wife, his children, and his freedom. Jasmine! My mother gasped, her eyes darting frantically between me and Brandon. Jasmine filed for divorce, but she was just at the house. She was just comforting you, Brandon. She was acting Patricia. I clarified, my tone devoid of any sympathy. She played you perfectly. She knew about the forged mortgage for a month. She knew you were conspiring to extort me to cover up your federal crimes. So she allied with me. She provided the internal documents from Richard's safe that proved your massive embezzlement scheme. She gave me the very leverage I needed to execute this takeover. My father let out a low, agonizing groan. He buried his face in his hands, finally understanding the catastrophic scale of his failure. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of control and success, but it was all a lie, and now the truth was laid bare in front of him. You destroyed us, my mother whispered, her voice trembling as tears streamed down her perfectly made-up face. You destroyed your own family, Olivia. For what money power, you are a sick, vindictive monster. I am a businesswoman, I repeated, standing up from the executive chair. I protected my assets from a group of criminals who tried to extort me. You made the choices that led you here. I simply accelerated the consequences. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Before leaving, I turned back to face them. They looked broken, defeated, and entirely pathetic. The eviction notices for the Oak Brook property, and this mansion will be served by the end of the week, I stated, my voice echoing in the silent boardroom. The corporate takeover of the distribution company is effective immediately. You will be escorted from the premises by my security team. You are no longer permitted on any Apex Holdings property. I did not wait for a response. I walked out of the boardroom, the heavy glass doors closing behind me with a decisive click. The hostile takeover was complete. The financial execution was flawless. But the emotional payoff was surprisingly complex. I felt a profound sense of relief, a weight lifted from my shoulders, but also a lingering hollow ache for the family I never truly had. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, my phone buzzed with an incoming message from Jasmine. It was a single word: done. The divorce papers had been served. The police report filed. The final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. Brandon was officially facing a federal indictment for wire fraud and forgery, and his parents were staring down decades in a federal penitentiary for massive embezzlement and tax evasion. I stepped out of the skyscraper into the freezing Chicago air, pulling my coat tight against the wind. The city bustled around me, oblivious to the monumental shift in power that had just occurred 40 floors above. I walked toward my waiting car, my mind already racing with the next steps for my software platform and the expansion of Apex Holdings. The hostile takeover was just the beginning. I had proven that I was not the weak, fearful girl my parents had raised me to be. I was a formidable force, a woman who could dismantle a toxic empire and build a new one from the ashes. And as I drove away from the towering glass building, I knew that I would never again allow anyone, least of all my own blood, to threaten my success or my peace of mind. The legal and financial fallout from the hostile takeover unfolded with brutal efficiency over the next few weeks. Apex Holdings, under my covert direction, aggressively liquidated the assets of my parents' distribution company. The warehouses, the inventory, the fleet of delivery trucks. Everything was sold off to the highest bidder to satisfy the massive debt consolidation. The most critical priority was the restoration of the employees' pension fund. Using the meticulous documentation Jasmine had secured from my father's safe, Harrison worked closely with federal regulators to untangle the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts my parents had used to embezzle the funds. The process was arduous, but we managed to recover and replenish the retirement savings of the 80 innocent working-class families whose futures had been jeopardized by my parents' greed. The eviction process for Brandon's Oak Brook property and my parents' sprawling mansion moved swiftly. The shadow lenders, now legally represented by Apex Holdings, executed the default clauses without hesitation. Brandon was forcibly removed from the $1.2 million home, his belongings boxed up and left on the curb. He had nowhere to go, no money, and no family to bail him out. He ended up renting a tiny, dilapidated apartment on the outskirts of the city, working a minimum wage job as a delivery driver to barely scrape by. My parents fared no better. Their mansion, the symbol of their elite social standing and country club lifestyle, was seized and sold at auction. They were forced to move into a cramped, low-income rental apartment stripped of their luxury vehicles, their designer wardrobes, and their illusion of superiority. The country club immediately revoked their membership, and their friends vanished the moment the news of the hostile takeover and the impending federal investigation broke. The criminal charges against Brandon, Patricia, and Richard proceeded with relentless momentum. The Department of Labor, armed with the undeniable evidence of pension embezzlement and tax fraud, launched a full-scale federal investigation. Brandon was indicted for wire fraud, identity theft, and bank fraud related to the forged second mortgage. My parents faced a litany of federal charges, including conspiracy, embezzlement, and massive tax evasion. The trials were heavily publicized, drawing intense media scrutiny. The public narrative shifted entirely. The story of a greedy, vindictive daughter abandoning her depressed brother was replaced by the shocking revelation of a wealthy, corrupt family orchestrating a multi-million-dollar extortion plot and stealing from their own employees to cover up their son's felonies. The perfect, loyal family facade was completely shattered, exposing the toxic, rotting core beneath. But before the media circus began, before the federal indictments were unsealed and the eviction notices were served, there was one final desperate moment inside the Apex Holdings boardroom. The absolute finality of their destruction had finally registered, shattering the last remaining fragments of their towering arrogance. The grand projection screen behind me still glowed with the undeniable proof of their financial annihilation. My parents were not looking at the screen anymore. They were looking at me, finally recognizing that the daughter they had abused and discarded was now the sole architect of their ruin. The transition from predatory extortionists to pathetic beggars was jarring and immediate. My mother, Patricia, was the first to physically collapse. The woman who had proudly paraded her country club status and mocked my early ambitions could no longer support her own weight. Her knees hit the polished hardwood floor with a heavy thud. She crawled forward, her expensive designer dress dragging against the ground, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her cultivated dignity. She reached out her trembling hands, grasping at the air just inches from my immaculate white shoes. "Please, Olivia," my mother wailed, her voice cracking into a high hysterical pitch. "Have mercy on us. We are family. We are your blood. You cannot do this to your own mother and father. We raised you. We loved you." I stared down at her, feeling absolutely immune to her performance. It was a fascinating psychological display. She was using the exact same emotional manipulation tactics she had weaponized at the Christmas dinner. Back then, she had shrieked about family loyalty to extort $17 million from me. Now she was weaponizing those identical phrases to beg for her survival. She believed that if she cried hard enough, if she invoked the sacred bond of motherhood, the conditioned obedience she had violently drilled into me would automatically activate. She thought I was still that terrified college student desperate for her approval. "Get up, Patricia," I commanded, my voice devoid of any warmth. "You are embarrassing yourself. Family loyalty is a concept you only invoke when you need a human shield or a blank check. You did not care about family when you tried to drain my bank accounts on Christmas Eve. You did not care about family when you actively stole the retirement funds of your warehouse workers to protect a felon." My father, Richard, fell to his knees right beside her. The great patriarch, the man who had physically blocked my exit from the dining room and thrown a pen at my face, was now weeping openly. His face was slick with sweat and tears, his broad shoulders shaking with terror. He clasped his hands together in a gesture of pure, unadulterated begging. "We will do anything you want, Olivia." My father pleaded, his voice a pathetic, rattling whisper. "We will sign over the voting rights. We will give you full operational control of the distribution company. Just please let us keep the house. Let us avoid prison. We will disown Brandon. We will testify against him. We will tell the federal investigators that he masterminded the entire embezzlement scheme. Just spare us." "You would sell out your favorite son to keep your mansion," I observed them coldly. "That is the true foundation of this family, absolute ruthless self-preservation." "He ruined us!" my mother screamed, turning her vitriol toward Brandon before looking back up at me with desperate, pleading eyes. "He was a mistake. We see that now, Olivia. We were wrong. You are the successful one. You are the brilliant one. We are so incredibly proud of you. Please just give us another chance to be a real family. We can work for you. We can rebuild together." The sheer toxicity of her plea was suffocating. She was attempting to validate my lifelong achievements only because I was currently holding a blade to her throat. She did not respect my business acumen. She was just terrified of my leverage. I felt a fleeting, distant echo of the young girl who would have given anything to hear her mother say she was proud. But that girl had died a long time ago, killed by their relentless cruelty. The woman sitting in the executive chair felt nothing but cold, clinical closure. "Your pride is completely worthless to me," I stated, leaning forward and looking directly into their terrified eyes. "You do not get to praise the empire you actively tried to burn down. You do not get to claim the daughter you discarded. You sat at that dining room table and told me I was a selfish, greedy girl. You demanded that I hand over my life's work to subsidize your criminal negligence. You tried to use the federal court system to freeze my assets and force a hostile settlement. I stood up slowly, towering over them as they groveled on the floor. I walked around the massive mahogany table, stopping just inches from where they kneeled. They looked up at me, their faces contorted with a desperate, pathetic hope that I might suddenly display the mercy they had consistently denied me. "You made a fatal miscalculation," I continued, my voice echoing off the glass walls of the boardroom. "You assumed my silence in that mediation room was weakness. You assumed my refusal to argue was defeat. But I was not hiding from you. I was simply letting you construct your own prison. You begged a shadow equity firm for a lifeline, and you willingly signed your own execution warrant." Brandon finally found his voice, a trembling whimper. "Please, Olivia, I have nothing." I looked down at my brother, then at my parents kneeling beside him. I delivered the final devastating blow, ensuring these words would haunt them for the rest of their impoverished lives. "You told me I stole his future," I said, my voice dropping to an icy whisper. "I didn't. I just bought it, and its market value is zero." I watched the last shred of their entitlement evaporate into the cold, sterilized air of the Apex Holdings boardroom. The absolute silence that followed my final declaration was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I pressed a button under my desk, and two large, impeccably dressed security guards entered the room immediately. They did not touch my family, but their looming presence was enough. My parents and my brother gathered themselves off the floor, moving like hollow shells of the arrogant predators who had ambushed me on Christmas Eve. They walked out of the glass double doors without a single backward glance, escorted directly to the freight elevator. They were no longer executives or elite suburbanites. They were trespassers. The legal and financial avalanche that followed was swift, brutal, and entirely public. Jasmine executed her exit strategy with the ruthless precision of a master tactician. Because she had actively cooperated with Harrison and provided the critical internal documents proving the corporate embezzlement, we ensured she was completely shielded from the fallout. Her divorce proceedings moved at lightning speed. Armed with undeniable proof of Brandon's felony forgery and reckless gambling addiction, the family court judge granted Jasmine sole legal and physical custody of their two children. Brandon was stripped of all visitation rights, pending a psychological evaluation and the conclusion of his federal criminal case. Furthermore, to protect her and my niece and nephew, I transferred the deed of the Oakbrook property out of the Apex distressed asset portfolio and placed it directly into an irrevocable trust for her children. Jasmine maintained her pristine professional reputation in the Chicago real estate market. She rebranded herself, entirely leveraging her newfound freedom to launch her own luxury brokerage firm. She was safe, autonomous, and forever free from my family's toxic grasp. Brandon's reality, however, fractured into a spectacular nightmare. The shadow lenders, furious over the fraudulent second mortgage, handed all their documentation directly over to the federal authorities. The Department of Justice does not care about golden child syndrome or manipulative mothers. 3 weeks after the boardroom meeting, federal agents arrived at the cheap motel Brandon was temporarily hiding in. He was arrested and officially indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and bank fraud. There was no secret family bailout waiting in the wings. There was no Patricia to write a check and sweep the felony under the rug. Brandon was denied bail due to the severe flight risk and the overwhelming mountain of forensic evidence stacked against him. He was remanded to a federal holding facility in downtown Chicago, forced to trade his $3,000 bespoke suits for an orange jumpsuit. He sat in a concrete cell, awaiting a trial that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years. The boy who had been handed the world on a silver platter had finally encountered a problem that his parents' stolen money could not solve. My parents suffered a downfall that was almost Shakespearean in its absolute devastation. The Department of Labor initiated a massive, highly publicized audit of their distribution company. The news of their multi-million-dollar pension embezzlement scheme hit the local Chicago business journals, completely obliterating their carefully curated social standing. But the deepest cut was the loss of their primary residence. Apex Holdings executed the foreclosure on their sprawling suburban mansion with aggressive speed. On a freezing Tuesday morning, The county sheriff arrived at their wrought iron gates with an official eviction notice. They were given exactly 2 hours to vacate the premises. I did not attend the eviction, but Harrison sent a proxy to oversee the asset seizure. He reported that Patricia wept hysterically on the front lawn as movers boxed up her designer furniture to be auctioned off to satisfy their corporate debts. Stripped of their company, their mansion, and their stolen wealth, Richard and Patricia were forced to relocate to a cramped two-bedroom low-income rental apartment on the far industrial outskirts of the city. The transition was agonizing for them. The elite country club where my mother had spent decades gossiping and flaunting her superiority permanently revoked their membership, citing the strict moral turpitude clause in their bylaws. Their wealthy friends, the very people they had tried to impress by destroying me, abandoned them instantly. No one wanted to be associated with federal criminals who stole retirement funds from warehouse workers. My father, a man who once commanded a massive logistics empire, was reduced to applying for entry-level administrative jobs just to keep the lights on in their tiny apartment, but his pending federal indictment made him completely unemployable. They were completely isolated, trapped in a claustrophobic space together, blaming each other daily for the catastrophic collapse of their lives. I monitored the fallout from the quiet sanctuary of my downtown penthouse, reading the legal updates Harrison forwarded to my inbox. The justice was absolute and undeniable. They had spent their entire lives treating me as an afterthought, an inconvenience, a financial resource to be tapped whenever their favored son demanded more. They had weaponized the concept of family to justify staggering abuse and systemic fraud. Now they were left with nothing but the consequences of their own spectacular greed. The nightmare that began on Christmas Eve was officially over. The toxic empire they had built on lies and stolen money had been meticulously dismantled and sold off for parts. As I closed the final legal dossier on my laptop, I felt a profound settling peace. The storm had finally passed, and the wreckage of their lives was entirely their own burden to carry. I stood up, walked to my expansive windows, and looked out over the gleaming city skyline, ready to focus completely on the bright, limitless future I had built for myself. With the toxic debris of my past entirely cleared away, my professional trajectory accelerated with terrifying speed. Vanguard Capital, initially spooked by Brandon's fraudulent legal notices, returned to the negotiating table with an entirely new level of respect. They had watched Harrison dismantle a multi-million-dollar extortion plot and a federal embezzlement scheme without my company missing a single operational beat. Investors do not just invest in software, they invest in founders who can weather catastrophic storms. We closed the Series B funding round at a staggering valuation of $75 million. My platform expanded into international markets, deploying supply chain logistics software across Europe and Asia. I hired 50 new employees, moving our headquarters into a massive state-of-the-art facility in the heart of Chicago. The success was monumental, but it was no longer just about generating revenue. I had a much larger mission in mind. I took a significant portion of my personal equity and established an entirely new venture capital firm. I named it Vanguard Horizon. It was a highly specialized incubator designed with one specific demographic in mind. I wanted to fund female founders who possessed brilliant disruptive business plans, but absolutely zero familial support. I wanted to back the women who were told their ambitions were silly little hobbies. I wanted to finance the entrepreneurs whose parents refused to co-sign a $5,000 loan for server racks. We provided seed capital, aggressive mentorship, and elite legal protection against predatory forces. Watching these women scale their businesses, watching them break generational cycles of financial abuse and build their own independent empires, became the most deeply fulfilling work of my entire life. I was actively replacing the toxic culture I had survived with an ecosystem built on merit, resilience, and genuine empowerment. The true measure of my victory arrived 11 months later on Thanksgiving Day. In the past, holidays were suffocating, anxiety-inducing events. They were battlegrounds where my mother served backhanded compliments alongside the turkey, and my father kept a running tally of my perceived failures. But this Thanksgiving was profoundly different. I hosted dinner in my downtown penthouse, the massive dining table overlooking the glittering lights of the city I had conquered. The air was filled with the rich scents of roasted herbs and genuine, unfiltered laughter. There were no underlying tensions, no passive-aggressive remarks, and absolutely no conditional love. I looked down the length of the table at the family I had actively chosen. Jasmine sat near the center, looking more radiant and successful than ever. Her luxury real estate brokerage was thriving, and she had completely reclaimed her identity after Brandon's catastrophic downfall. Her two young children were happily eating, completely shielded from the criminal legacy of their father. Harrison sat at the far end, trading sharp, witty corporate war stories with my chief operating officer, Ryan. They were surrounded by my closest friends, loyal mentors, and a few of the incredible women I had funded through Vanguard Horizon. Every single person in that room had earned their seat at my table through mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and shared integrity. There was no screaming, no shattered crystal, and no one demanding a $17 million check to equalize their failures. I raised my glass of sparkling cider, catching Jasmine's eye. We shared a quiet, knowing smile that spoke volumes. We had both walked through absolute fire, but we had not let it burn us to ash. We had used the flames to forge an unbreakable armor. As the gentle clinking of glasses and the warm hum of conversation filled my home, I allowed myself a moment of profound internal reflection. For 33 years, I had been conditioned to believe that blood was an absolute mandate. I had been taught that family was a lifelong debt that you paid with your mental health, your boundaries, and your financial security. But staring at the incredible, vibrant community gathered in my home, I finally understood the fundamental truth that had set me free. Blood does not entitle anyone to your peace. Sharing a last name does not give someone a permanent, unrestricted license to disrespect your boundaries or demand access to your paycheck. Real family is not assigned to you at birth by pure biological chance. Real family is built. It is constructed through years of showing up, through honoring boundaries, and through celebrating each other's victories without a shred of jealousy. My parents and my brother had weaponized their titles as mother, father, and son to justify their systemic abuse. They believed those titles made them untouchable. But the moment I stopped valuing their titles and started evaluating their actual behavior, their power over me completely evaporated. I had lost my biological family, but I had gained the entire world in the process. I had built a multi-million-dollar tech empire, launched a fund to empower a new generation of fierce women, and created a sanctuary of peace that no toxic relative could ever breach. The narrative that I was a disappointing, selfish daughter had been permanently rewritten. I was a sovereign executive, a loyal friend, and a woman who absolutely refused to apologize for her own success. The empire I built was impregnable, and its foundation was pure, unadulterated truth. Have you ever had to draw a hard line and completely cut off toxic family members who tried to manipulate your success or cross your boundaries? How did you find the courage to walk away and build a chosen family that truly respects your worth? Share your stories and experiences in the comments below. If this journey of reclaiming power and building an independent empire resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about overcoming manipulation and demanding the respect you deserve. Remember, your peace is your most valuable asset, and you never owe it to anyone who refuses to earn it. The saga of Olivia and her predatory family illuminates a harsh but necessary truth: shared DNA is not a lifelong contract for enduring abuse. Society often conditions us to believe that family must be accommodated and financially supported, no matter how toxic the dynamic becomes. However, true connection is rooted in mutual respect, not relentless extraction. When blood ties are weaponized to justify extortion, manipulation, and profound disrespect, severing those ties is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of sheer survival. Olivia's journey highlights the danger of the golden child dynamic, and the devastating lengths to which enablers will go to protect their preferred narrative. Her parents were willing to sacrifice her livelihood and commit federal crimes just to shield her brother from the consequences of his own felonies. This teaches us that you cannot negotiate with people who view your boundaries as a personal insult and your success as their personal bank account. By stripping away the emotional manipulation and looking purely at their actions, Olivia was able to dismantle their power. She realized that she did not owe her abusers a seat at her table. Ultimately, the most profound takeaway is that you have the absolute right to curate your own circle. You are allowed to build a chosen family composed of people who celebrate your victories rather than scheme to steal them. Your peace of mind and your hard-earned assets are yours to protect, and you never have to apologize for defending them against those who refuse to earn their place in your life. Take control of your own narrative today by setting unbreakable boundaries and walking away from anyone who refuses to respect your worth.